The farmland stretched wide under the late afternoon sun, a patchwork of rippling grain fields and dust-choked dirt roads. The convoy moved steadily across it, a long column of steel and rubber that left its own trail of haze behind. Supply trucks carried fuel, rations, and ammunition, their engines rumbling low and heavy. Up ahead and alongside, up-armored Humvees and mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles kept watch, their turrets swiveling lazily though no threat had yet appeared. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like another routine escort. But Dana felt the weight of fragility with every mile. She sat forward in her seat, helmet snug, braid tucked beneath, her hands steady on the binoculars that never seemed to leave her grasp for long. Each time she raised them, the farmland seemed too still. Farmers in the distance leaned on tools or stood at the edges of their fields, shading their eyes against the sun as the convoy rolled past. There was nothing overtly threatening about them, but Dana found their stillness unnatural, as if the land itself had been waiting. Inside the trucks, the soldiers tried to keep themselves distracted. A private in the rear vehicle tapped a rhythm against the steel door with the edge of his boot. Another cracked jokes into the radio, half-hearted ones that drew chuckles without lifting the underlying unease. Routine chatter filled the airwaves, a low hum of static and clipped voices. To most of the convoy, the rhythm of movement offered reassurance. To Dana, it only deepened the sense that they were being lulled into a false calm. The dust hanging above the trucks drifted into the air like a visible beacon. She thought about how it must look from a ridgeline a mile away, a clear trail advertising their location with no effort to hide it. The grain fields rippled in the wind, but the movement felt more like a warning than a comfort. Each wave, a reminder of how easily something could be concealed within. She lowered her binoculars and glanced at the soldiers nearest to her, noting their relaxed posture, their helmets tilted back, their eyes half closed. She envied them the ease of it, even as she distrusted it. She lifted the binoculars again. Through the shifting heat haze, she caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of a field. A farmer, perhaps, dressed in worn clothes, leaning on a hoe. He was motionless, too motionless, the kind of stillness that unsettled her instincts. She tracked him for a moment until the road bent and the dust swallowed him from view. She let the glasses drop, exhaling slowly, her lips pressed into a line. The convoy stretched like a fragile thread across the open farmland, each vehicle dependent on the other, each man and woman inside trusting the line to hold. Dana knew better. A single strike at the right point could unravel everything, and there would be no time to knit it back together. She tried to imagine how quickly the chatter would turn to screams, how the laughter would cut short, how the calm would shatter. The thought was not fear so much as certainty. She adjusted her helmet strap and shifted in her seat. The binoculars felt heavy in her hands. More than just glass and metal, they were the only thing that gave her an edge, the only tool to see what others could not. She raised them again, scanning the next stretch of farmland. A pair of children ran along the edge of a field, waving at the convoy. Soldiers waved back without hesitation, grateful for something normal. Dana did not wave. She watched the line of trees behind the children instead, waiting for the flicker of movement that would betray something else. The road stretched on, curving between fields that glowed gold beneath the sun. The convoy rumbled through it, steady but exposed, dust rising, radios murmuring, soldiers joking and yawning in the false safety of routine. Dana kept scanning, her shoulders tight, her stomach wound into a knot she did not show. Each mile deepened the tension rather than eased it. Each detail stood out sharper, as though the world were narrowing its focus onto them. When the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the fields, deepening the lines of the land. Dana's binoculars caught something that made her pulse tighten. A patch of grain lay flattened, not by wind, but by weight. It was not recent enough to be obvious, but not old enough to be dismissed. She stared at it, her thoughts tightening, her unease hardening into dread. She lowered the glasses and fixed her gaze ahead, jaw set. The calm was ending, though no one else knew it yet. The first blast came without warning. A single concussion cracked the air apart, followed by another, then a third. The world turned into thunder and fire. The convoy jolted to a halt as shockwaves rippled through the earth. Dust leapt upward, a choking wall that blotted out the fields. Dana's ears rang as though her skull itself had been struck, the sound collapsing into a thin, high whine. Another shell crashed into the line. A supply truck pitched sideways, its frame twisting before it rolled onto its side. The rear axle snapped, and crates spilled across the dirt, bursting open to scatter rations and metal fragments. A Humvee turret swung halfway, around, and jammed, its gunner struggling as the vehicle shuddered under the blast. Radios erupted into a cacophony of static and voices, half of them cut off mid-word. Dana shoved her shoulder against the door and dropped into the smoke. The ground vibrated beneath her boots, a tremor that felt endless, as if the earth itself had turned unstable. The air reeked of fuel and scorched grain. She spotted the overturned truck ahead and sprinted toward it, body low, lungs filling with grit. A driver crawled from the shattered windshield, blood streaking his cheek, his eyes glazed. Dana grabbed his harness, hauled him clear of the wreck, and dragged him behind the cover of the burning vehicle. Another explosion hammered close, showering her with dirt and debris. Her teeth rattled, and her chest clenched under the force. She spat, wiped grit from her eyes, and forced her focus forward. A cluster of soldiers staggered in the open, dazed and deafened, their weapons hanging uselessly at their sides. She ran to them, grabbing one by the collar, shoving him toward the shelter of another truck. Her voice cut through the ringing in their ears, sharp and commanding. Words half shouted and half growled until they moved. Smoke curled upward from engines already burning, rising in thick plumes like black signal fires against the fading sky. Grain fields lay crushed where shockwaves had flattened them, their even ripples now broken into jagged scars. Dana coughed, pulling her rifle to her shoulder, the familiar weight steadying her hands. The rifle was more than a weapon in that moment. It was control, an anchor against the chaos, the single thing that made her feel she could impose order on the collapse unfolding around her. She kept moving, dragging another man from the cab of a disabled truck, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, but she pulled him behind cover anyway, pressing his rifle into his hands even as his fingers shook. All around her, panic bled through the unit. Some shouted into radios that answered only with static. Others crouched behind wrecks, blinking and lost. The suddenness of the strike had ripped order apart. Another detonation flung shrapnel across the road. Metal pinged and screeched, a shard slicing across Dana's arm. She gritted her teeth, ignored the sting, and lifted her head through the haze. The convoy was not moving. The column was broken, pinned in place by fire and wreckage. She felt her breath tighten in her chest. If they stayed like this, they would be annihilated. She braced herself against the hot metal of a truck, her rifle tucked tight, her throat raw as she shouted orders into the smoke. She forced them to regroup, to pull wounded into cover, to set rifles toward the tree line. She pushed a soldier into a firing position, adjusted another's stance, and filled the gaps herself when no one else moved. The chaos pressed down like a physical weight, but she refused to let it swallow her. The blasts slowed, fewer but heavier, each one closer than the last. Dana crouched behind a barricade of debris, lungs burning, arms trembling from strain. Her vision blurred from sweat and smoke, but she forced her gaze outward. Through the haze she saw movement at the edge of the fields. Shapes flickered in the drifting grain, faint but deliberate. She recognized the pattern immediately. It was not random fire. It was the beginning of an advance. Her heart pounded hard enough to hurt. She steadied her rifle, checked the chamber, and forced her breathing into rhythm. Around her, the convoy was a wreck of burning engines and bloodied men, still reeling from the sudden violence. The air reeked of cordite, scorched fuel, and singed earth. Every breath scraped her lungs raw. The soldiers looked to her now, their eyes wide, their voices hoarse, waiting for direction. She lifted her head and shouted again, clear despite the chaos. Her words carried over the static, cutting through the smoke. She did not let her fear show. She could not. The ground shook again with another detonation. Fire leapt from a crater, embers raining onto the field. Dana's ears rang with the impact, but she kept her rifle up, her focus locked. Through the firelight and the curling smoke, she saw the truth. This was not a strike meant to scatter them. It was the opening of something larger. The enemy was coming, not to harass, but to finish them. The convoy had stopped moving. Trucks clogged the road in a twisted line of wreckage, one overturned, another burning. Several more pressed bumper to bumper as though frozen in panic. Radios screeched with overlapping voices, none clear, each one demanding orders that never came. Dana pushed the static aside, focusing on the chaos in front of her. Smoke rolled heavy across the farmland, a gray curtain that dimmed the sun and blurred the edges of the world. Visibility shrank to 100 yards at most, then less. Soldiers scattered along the line. Some crouched behind wrecked trucks, clutching their rifles without firing. Others pressed themselves flat into the dirt, too stunned to move. A few stood exposed, staring blankly as though waiting for someone else to tell them what to do. Dana knew the strike had broken their rhythm, cut the convoy into pieces. If she did not stitch it back together, the next wave would crush them. She slung her rifle across her chest and ran toward a Humvee, boots slipping in the churned soil. The gunner sat frozen in the turret, wide-eyed, his hands trembling against the grips of the heavy machine gun. Dana slammed a hand against the steel and shouted up to him, her voice hard enough to snap him back into motion. She pointed toward the tree line, a dark line through the smoke, and he swung the gun that way. The rattle of the .50 caliber filled the air, brass clattering down into the Humvee bed. She turned and sprinted toward the overturned supply truck, its wheels still spinning slowly in the air. Several riflemen huddled against it, their breathing ragged. Dana dropped beside them and pressed a hand against the scorched metal, heat searing her palm through the glove. She barked for them to spread out, to cover the gaps between the vehicles. When they only stared, she shoved one toward position herself, forcing him behind a broken axle where he could at least fire with cover. The wrecks became barricades, crude walls forged from destruction. Dana saw it clearly even as the others faltered. She grabbed one of the soldiers by the harness, dragged him to the truck bed, and yanked open a crate of ammunition. The belt spilled out heavy and dull, and she shoved them into his arms. He blinked at her, then finally moved toward the Humvee that had fallen silent. Dana dragged more boxes herself, hauling them over the dirt, grit cutting into her knees each time she stumbled. Bullets snapped through the smoke, sharp cracks that struck sparks from the metal hulls. Dana dropped against the overturned truck, breath short, then pushed herself up again. She shoved belts into the waiting hands of a gunner and slapped the side of the Humvee, demanding fire. The gunner obeyed, the clatter of the heavy weapon filling the smoke-choked road. Each burst shook the air, steady and punishing, the rhythm a counter to the panic that threatened to spread. The smell of fuel hung thick, mixed with smoke and the copper tang of blood. Dana coughed, spat dust, and scrambled onto the side of a wrecked truck. From there, she could see the broken shape of the convoy. Some vehicles burned, others smoldered, their cargo scattered across the dirt road. Men and women huddled where they could, rifles pointing in the wrong directions, firing sporadically without focus. She shouted down at them, words sharp and cutting, breaking through their shock. Bit by bit, they shifted, pulling themselves together under her voice. The smoke worked both ways. It hid the enemy's exact positions, but it also concealed the defenders. Dana used it, pulling soldiers back from exposed ground, moving them behind trucks where they could wait unseen. The overturned vehicles, once symbols of collapse, became fortresses. Each broken shape was another wall, another firing point. She forced herself to believe they could hold if they made the wreckage into a line. A machine gun sputtered and fell silent. Dana was already moving, scrambling over hot steel and broken glass to reach it. The gunner shouted that he was out, panic in his eyes. She dropped another belt into his lap, slapped the receiver, and yanked the charging handle back until the weapon snapped ready. The gun roared to life again, cutting into the haze. The repetition steadied her heartbeat, the rhythm becoming something she could measure against. She moved constantly, never stopping long enough to feel the fear clawing at the edges. She climbed wrecks, dragged ammo boxes, pressed rifles into shaking hands. She shouted until her throat was raw, until even the dazed ones began to listen. The men and women of the convoy started to fire where she pointed, their bullets snapping through the haze toward the tree line. The fragments of the convoy knit into something like a line again, fragile, but holding. Brass casings piled underfoot, sliding beneath boots as the Humvees kept their guns running. The sound became constant, a clatter that filled every gap between the explosions. Dana spat grit from her mouth, her teeth grinding with sand. Her gloves burned from hot metal, but she refused to stop. Each ammo box emptied faster than the last. Each belt fed into the machine guns bought them another sliver of time. Still, the smoke drifted, a shifting curtain that moved with the wind. Each gust revealed glimpses of the farmland beyond a burned tree. A cratered ditch, the shimmer of heat above torn earth. Dana scanned it all, eyes sharp, pulse thudding in her ears. She knew reinforcements would not come in time. Survival depended on what they built here. Now, in the wreckage of their own convoy. She paused, crouched behind the burning husk of a truck. Sweat trickled down her cheek, cutting a line through the soot. Her breath rasped in her throat, chest tight, arms aching from the weight of ammo and rifles. For a moment she listened, really listened, past the gunfire and the shouting. The noise seemed to shift. It was no longer only random bursts in the distance. It was movement. Through the drifting smoke, shapes emerged at the edges of the fields, shadows in the haze, spreading, low and deliberate. Dana tightened her grip on her rifle, eyes narrowing. The line was holding for now, but the true fight had only just begun. The enemy was closing in. The first rocket-propelled grenade tore through the smoke with a shriek that split the air. It struck the side of a truck with a violent flash, ripping steel apart and showering shrapnel across the barricade. The explosion flung dirt high and left a hole in the line. The convoy's defense, already fragile, staggered under the impact. A second rocket screamed in, slamming into the ground between two vehicles, throwing men and dust upward in a chaotic spray. Small arms fire followed. Bursts of rifles rattled out of the tree line, the muzzle flashes faint behind the smoke. Bullets struck the metal barricades, sparking and whining, each one a reminder of how thin their protection was. Dana dropped behind cover, lifted her rifle, and fired into the shifting haze. The crack of her shots blended with the staccato rhythm of machine guns. The Humvees opened up, their heavy weapons sweeping across the fields. The 50 caliber guns thundered, each burst shaking the earth, scything down the stalks of grain like men falling in waves. The mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles joined in, their turrets spitting fire, cutting through the assaulting fighters. Brass poured onto the dirt, clattering against steel as the air thickened with smoke and burning powder. Dana barked orders, her voice ragged but sharp. She shoved riflemen into position, dragging one man by his harness when he faltered. She pressed her shoulder against a scorched panel, leaned out, and fired a controlled burst that dropped two figures running low through the haze. The recoil jarred her arms, but the steadiness of the weapon grounded her. The rifle was her lifeline. Her will turned into steel and fire. A scream of warning came from the left. Another rocket streaked in, striking a barricade of wreckage. The blast hurled Dana back, her helmet slamming against the ground. Her ears rang, her lungs seized, but she forced herself upright. Fire spread quickly from a ruptured fuel tank, flames licking outward across the soil, threatening to engulf the line. She seized a flare from her vest, struck it, and hurled it into a ditch where spilled fuel pooled. The liquid caught with a rush. flames leaping high. The fire raced along the ditch, forming a barrier of heat and smoke. It lit the haze in violent orange, a flickering wall between survival and collapse. The enemy fighters pushed harder, shadows weaving through the smoke, rifles blazing. Dana shouted for covering fire and sprinted across the open ground, her boots pounding against dirt slick with oil and blood. Bullets snapped around her, one tugging at her sleeve, another striking sparks from a wreck a foot away. She slid behind a stalled vehicle, gasping for air, then vaulted upward to haul herself into the jammed turret. The gunner had been hit, slumped over the controls. Dana shoved him aside gently, bracing herself against the hot metal. She slammed her boot against the jammed feed, wrenching it loose. The weapon clattered, seized, then finally locked into place. She pulled the charging handle back with both hands until it snapped forward. The gun roared to life, hammering the tree line, cutting bright arcs through the smoke. She fired in long bursts, sweeping left to right, her arms shaking with the strain. The turret vibrated violently, rattling her teeth, but she clung to it, refusing to let go. The smell of burning oil and gunpowder stung her throat, her lungs clawing for air. But she kept the weapon firing. The mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle that had fallen silent now spat fire again, its broken machine brought back to life through sheer determination. Below her, the riflemen steadied, encouraged by the renewed thunder. They fired in volleys, short bursts snapping against the haze. The barricades of overturned trucks glowed from the firelight, jagged walls forged from destruction. Smoke rolled thick across the ground, turning the battlefield into a maze of shifting shadows. Figures darted through, some cut down by fire, others stumbling closer. Dana shouted until her voice cracked, calling targets, driving her soldiers to hold the line. The firefight stretched on, relentless. Each wave of fighters broke against the barricades, leaving bodies scattered among flattened fields. The grain that once swayed in calm rhythm was shredded, stalks cut down as if reaped by war itself. Dana's arms ached, her shoulder bruised from recoil, but she refused to pause. Each pull of the trigger felt like defiance, a statement that they would not break. Another wave pushed closer, throwing grenades that burst against the barricades. Shards of metal ricocheted off Dana's turret, sparks striking her helmet. She ducked, teeth clenched, then rose again to fire down into the figures charging through the smoke. The riflemen behind her fired until their magazines clicked empty, then slammed in fresh ones with metallic snaps. The rhythm of reloading, firing, and shouting became the heartbeat of the defense. The ditch fire burned hot and bright, flames licking higher with every gust of wind. It cast the battlefield in an uneven glow, shadows twisting across the wrecks and men alike. Fighters trying to cross were forced back, their silhouettes outlined before they fell. The fire was more than heat. It was a line between survival and collapse. A wall Dana had carved out of desperation. Her body screamed with exhaustion, but her mind stayed fixed. She dragged herself out of the turret, her hands raw, and dropped back to the ground. She moved to another position, shouldering her rifle again, firing into the haze, her vision blurred from smoke and sweat, her throat raw, but her grip never faltered. Every bullet was an act of refusal, every shout a demand that her soldiers stand. The enemy did not stop. More shadows surged through the fields, their voices raised, their rifles blazing. Dana pressed herself against the burning hull of a truck, firing until the bolt locked back. She slammed a new magazine home with shaking hands, yanked the charging handle, and rose again. Sparks flew as bullets struck around her. The barricades rattled under the constant hammer of fire. She stole a glance down the line. The Humvees still spat fire, their gunners drenched in sweat, brass piled high around their boots. Riflemen crouched behind panels, firing steady despite exhaustion. The barricades were scorched, battered, and cracked, but they held. The line, fragile and improvised, had not broken. Her chest heaved, each breath scraping her lungs. Her hands trembled from fatigue, her body coated in grime and blood. The fire from the ditch burned lower now, its fuel nearly spent. The battlefield glowed with embers and muzzle flashes, a storm of smoke and flame that seemed endless. Dana leaned against the hot metal, forcing herself upright. She knew they were far from finished. The enemy was still coming, wave after wave. Her body was nearly spent, but her will hardened. This was not about holding ground anymore. It was about enduring, about burning through every round, every ounce of strength, until nothing remained. She refused to yield. The line faltered. One by one, the Humvee guns sputtered and fell silent, their belts spent, barrels smoking uselessly. The silence between bursts felt heavier than the gunfire had, a vacuum that pulled fear into every gap. Dana heard it and knew the tide was turning. The defense was bleeding out. She shoved another belt into a gunner's hands, only to see him shake his head, the box already empty. Around her, crates lay scattered, their contents gone, the wood splintered and useless. Empty ammo boxes littered the ground like tombstones, each one a marker for the minutes they had lost. She kicked one aside and moved on, rifle tight in her grip, her breath sharp and fast. The smoke had thinned into a gray haze, no longer hiding the field. Through it came the insurgents, advancing low and quick, rifles flashing, bullets smacked against the wreckage, sparks jumping from steel, shards of glass raining down. Dana pressed against the hot side of a truck then leaned out and fired. 3 rounds dropped a man into the dirt, but more filled the space behind him, pushing closer. The barricades were no longer walls. They were cages. Fighters broke through gaps in the line, surging into the maze of burning hulks. The battlefield shrank, closing around them, the open farmland reduced to narrow alleys of smoke and twisted steel. Dana moved through it all, a blur of motion. She slammed the butt of her rifle into an attacker's jaw, heard the crack, then fired point blank into another who lunged past her shoulder. Blood spattered across the side of the wreck, streaking down to mix with the sheen of leaking oil. She dragged a bleeding soldier by the harness, pulling him behind the carcass of a truck. His breath rattled, his hands limp, but she pressed his rifle back into them anyway. Her own arms trembled from the weight of his body, her lungs burning with acrid smoke. She dropped beside him, shoulders heaving, then pushed herself up again. There was no pause, no safety. The fight pressed from every direction. Brass casings covered the ground, piles of them shifting under boots like small golden rivers. They crunched and slid as Dana ran, her rifle spitting fire until the bolt locked back. She slapped a new magazine in, slammed the charging handle, and kept moving. Her braid, tucked tight beneath her helmet, stuck to the back of her neck with sweat. A reminder of discipline and grit even as the world collapsed around her. A grenade burst against the side of a Humvee, tearing a hole in the barricade. Fighters poured through the gap, shouting, firing wildly. Dana sprinted to meet them, her throat raw as she screamed for her soldiers to hold. She fired until the magazine clicked empty, then swung the rifle like a club, driving the stock into a man's chest. He fell back into the smoke, tripping another behind him. She seized the chance to drag a new belt across the dirt and shove it into the waiting hands of a gunner who had been staring at an empty cradle. The battlefield closed in tighter. The smell of blood mixed with the stench of burning fuel. The wrecks glowed, their edges warped and molten, fragile fortresses of fire and ruin. Dana stumbled over debris, caught herself on the sharp edge of twisted steel, and felt blood streak across her glove. She ignored it, pulled herself up, and fired again. The haze shimmered with heat, shadows darting within it, figures appearing and vanishing as though the smoke itself fought against them. Everywhere she looked, the line buckled. Men shouted, some in pain, some in rage, others simply to keep themselves moving. Dana forced herself into every gap, reloading weapons, dragging bodies, shouting commands that cut through the chaos. Her voice grew hoarse, her body heavy, but she refused to slow. Each movement, each breath, was defiance. She dropped behind cover for a moment, chest heaving, her body shaking with fatigue. Blood ran down her temple, mixing with sweat and grime. She pressed her rifle to the ground, leaned her forehead against it, then forced herself upright again. Through the haze, she saw more shadows advancing. Relentless. Endless. The defense had minutes left. No more. Reinforcements were still nowhere in sight. Dana clenched her jaw, tightened her grip, and prepared to keep fighting until nothing remained. The barricades rattled under the final surge. Dana pressed her back against the burning hull of a truck, rifle heavy in her hands, breath scraping in her chest. Around her, the last of her soldiers clutched half-empty magazines, eyes hollow with fatigue, their movements jerky and slow. The enemy pushed through the haze in force, voices raised, rifles blazing, determined to crush what little resistance remained. She rose to fire again, her hands trembling, the recoil biting deeper into her bruised shoulder. Brass spilled around her boots, clinking against the broken ground. A figure rushed the barricade, and she pulled the trigger, dropping him at the edge. The line was holding by threads, fragile and breaking, each second stretched thin. Then came the sound, a low, distant growl that swelled into a roar. Engines heavy and unrelenting. The ground shook with the rhythm of tracks cutting through soil. Out of the smoke emerged Bradleys, their turrets already swiveling, their autocannons ripping into the assaulting fighters. The first burst tore the tree line apart, the second shredded the fields, enemy silhouettes collapsing in waves. The sound was overwhelming, a storm of fire that swallowed the chaos whole. The soldiers of the convoy sagged where they stood. Some lowered rifles, others simply sank to their knees, overcome by exhaustion and disbelief. Dana kept firing for another moment, then felt the rifle slip in her hands. Her grip loosened, her arms too heavy to hold it any longer. The weapon dropped against her leg, then clattered to the ground, its weight finally too much. Smoke swirled in the wake of advancing armor, rotor wash of displaced air clearing the battlefield. The haze lifted to reveal the devastation bodies scattered in the flattened fields, twisted wrecks glowing in the orange light of smoldering fires. The fields looked harvested, but what lay across them was no crop. It was the cost of survival. Dana stumbled back against a truck, her body coated in soot and blood. She slid down the scorched panel until she sat in the dirt, arms trembling, breath ragged, heart pounding without rhythm. Around her, the Bradleys thundered forward, cutting the last fighters down with ease. Relief washed over her, but it came cold and heavy, weighted with grief. Survival had come, but not triumph. It had been bought at terrible cost. Silence pressed down over the battlefield. The last echoes of gunfire had faded, leaving only the crackle of burning wrecks and the low rumble of armor settling into place. Smoke drifted across the flattened grain fields, rising in thin trails that curled into the evening sky like broken prayers. The trucks that had once carried their lifeline lay gutted and burned, blackened frames still smoldering. Survivors sat in small clusters among the wrecks, their faces gray with ash, eyes distant and hollow. Helmets lay scattered on the ground, some cracked, some streaked with blood. Brass casings glittered in the dirt as though the earth had yielded a false harvest. Reinforcements moved through the scene, but their presence felt muted, a force that had come too late to preserve what was lost. Dana walked among the wounded, her steps heavy, her uniform torn and stiff with blood and soot. She bent down to steady a man clutching his side, pressed her hand to another's shoulder, and spoke in low tones that carried no promise, but steadiness. Her helmet hung from her hand now, her braid falling loose, the sweat and grime of battle streaking her face. She carried her rifle slung at her side, not as a symbol of triumph, but as a weight she could not put down. The battlefield stretched before her as a scar across the land. The convoy had endured, but at a price that clung to every survivor. Dana's body trembled with exhaustion, but she kept moving, her dirt-caked hands still reaching for those who needed them. When at last she stopped, she stood at the edge of the ruined field, staring out over the wreckage. Survival had come, but it felt like nothing more than another fight endured, one of many still to come.